Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Firstly, to our listeners, apologies for not having recorded anything for a while. Your humble host had a mountain of personal issues to contend with, all of them good, I hasten to say, but rather complex to solve. Nonetheless, we are back, and as you can see, we are back with a different background. So I hope that we might be able to get to another podcast before I head off to Poland for a conference on the 23rd to 24th of May, hosted by the Polish Institute of International Affairs, where I'll be participating in a panel discussion on the Middle East and hunting for more talent to bring onto The Focus. In today's episode, we are going to be looking at a problem that will focus the minds leading up to the November 2024 US presidential election: the US-Mexican border crisis. To help unpack this topic, we are joined by Associate Professor of History at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., Julia Young. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and the like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Julia, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Julia, let's get stuck in. How has the ongoing situation at the US southern border impacted immigration policies and discourse leading up to the 2024 US election?
Well, you may have seen that the immigration, in the most recent polls, immigration has been listed by American voters as their number one issue of concern in the United States, right? And there is and that's really because throughout in the media and within the electorate, there's a sense that the immigration system is broken, that there's an immigration crisis, that there's a crisis along the border, that the border itself is broken. And that's the rhetoric that you see in the media and that you see sort of in the political sphere. And that is because of some recent events. So it's true that in the last few years, so since in particular, sort of since 2020, there have been steady increases in migration and migrant encounters, meaning both apprehensions and expulsions at the US-Mexico border. Those hit a record high in December of 2023. And so there's been lots of footage of crowds at the border. There have been instances of people rushing the border at particular places along the border. So there's been just a ton of media coverage of this issue, and it's been at the top of people's minds. But I just want to say, as a historian, that migration is really consistently a political issue in US immigration history, and has been for really more than a century. There has always been, and you could even go further back. As a historian, you can always move the starting place back, right? But there has been concern about each successive wave of migrants that has come into this country, almost really since its founding, but especially since the late 19th century and then throughout the 20th century. And so in a way, what we're seeing is new, but also not new, right? This increased concern about the number of immigrants that are coming in, about how they're coming in, and about what they mean for the United States and for US politics. And politicians have also fed on and generated rhetoric around migration throughout the 20th century, and including in the late 19th century and now into the 21st. So we can talk more about that, but I think this sense that migration is a crisis is tied to the recent spikes in migration, but it's also not exactly new.
Julia, I did a master's by research here at Flinders University back in the day on whether multicultural Australia could mobilize for war. And if you talk about migration waves and integration and the idea of not being able to fear the other, the new arrival coming in, the idea of a nation state's defensibility does come into play. How is the multicultural experiment going in the United States? Because from an Australian perspective, looking at the United States, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are all sorts of headline stories about people storming the border, guards and walls going up, and then you've got the Donald making his pronouncements about X, Y, and Z. It does seem as though it is almost like an existential crisis and quite ahistoric in a way.
Mhm. I think in the media, migration and migration crises are always treated like contemporary, like they're contemporary issues that are really that just almost have to do with the now, right? Our present day issues. And it's so as a historian, I've tried to work to, and many other historians have done this as well, I've tried to work to write publicly and speak publicly about what history can tell us about migration. So back to your point on this sort of the multicultural experiment, I mean, as a historian, what I can say is that if each generation of native born has had some level of discomfort about the foreign born that are arriving in the United States. Those foreign born have, within the process of a generation or two, become absorbed into the nation, have reached parity in levels of education and income and English language acquisition, right? By the third generation, almost universally, by the third generation, the descendants of immigrants are English only, actually. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of concern about what happens to the language. Are we all going to be speaking Spanish? Are we all going to be speaking German? And in fact, the children are generally bilingual and the grandchildren are generally monolingual in English, right? So our history has been one of absorbing successive waves of immigrants, while at the same time maintaining ethnic identities and pride in our multiculturalism. I mean, there's a lot of good there, right? I've joked with my family about, when we travel outside of the country, well, you just can't get this, you can't get the different types of food that you can get here in the United States, because we're such a multicultural country. And you really see that in our food landscape in some really fascinating ways. You see it in our music. So in our culture has been really successful in both like sort of absorbing and preserving different cultures within our multicultural landscape. And so has our economy. So that's speaking of the past. I can't predict the future, right? It's possible that this system doesn't work in the future, but I don't think so. I think based on our history of migration, these newest migrants that I'm saying we in quotes, right, that the native born are so worried about will experience a similar trajectory to previous generations of migrants. They'll come in, they'll work, they'll better their lives, they will, and their children and their children's children will become part of the fabric of the nation.
Julia, what are the major differences in the immigration platforms of the leading candidates in the 2024 US election, particularly regarding Latin American and Mexican immigrants?
Well, we have two very different candidates, but we also have, I actually wanted to start with something that they agree on. And I would say that they both agree that our immigration system is broken. They just have very different rhetoric about how it's broken and who broke it and what we should do about it, right? So our former President Trump, who's running again, talks about immigrants as lawbreakers and criminals. And he's said some really famous things about, Mexico's not sending its best people and really kind of slurring immigrants who come. And then he talks about solutions like building walls and deporting migrants, right? So he really takes this kind of, the system is broken. It's broken because people aren't obeying the laws. And so to fix it, we need to enforce the laws better and build walls and detain people and deport them. Biden, when he talks about the system being broken, focuses less on the action, less on sort of blaming migrants, although there's increasingly, I think, some rhetoric around, people need to follow the immigration laws and we want our immigration laws to be respected. But he also talks about fixing the laws and arriving at comprehensive immigration reform through the political process, also setting up or expanding legal pathways for both for people to come to the United States legally, but then also for people who are here who are undocumented, so people who have crossed the border illegally and then are living here without papers. He's talked about setting up legal pathways for those people to become citizens, right? For law-abiding, undocumented people who are contributing to society should have a chance to become citizens after following a process, right? There's really such a very limited process for them now. So I think he is increasingly acknowledging that the immigration system is broken, that it's becoming a bigger political problem for him. I mean, I think he and the Democrats are kind of more alarmed about what this rhetoric around the crisis of the border and what the surging numbers of migrants at the southern border will mean for the chances of re-election in 2024. So I would say that, like, and I can come back to this, but I think in some ways, both of them are not acknowledging the complexity of the problem and of fixing the migration system, right? Like, so Trump has always, in some pretty obvious ways, sort of promised very simplistic solutions. I mean, build a wall, you can't get more simple than that. And that's a solution that doesn't address at all the root causes of migration. We call them, when we study immigration, we talk about push factors and pull factors. And so factors that are pushing people out of their home countries and factors that are pulling people to come to the United States or attracting people to the United States. In a lot of ways, I think the Biden administration tends to do better at acknowledging the complexities of it, right? But it's almost going to be impossible with in our political landscape okay, well, again, I'm predicting here, but it has been impossible up to this point in our political landscape to agree on comprehensive immigration reform. So saying like, well, we just need better laws, we need to fix the laws, well, that's really a lot easier said than done.
Isn't part of the problem, Julia, the fact that you've got this bureaucratic edifice in charge of whatever the border security process happens to be, where people have criticized it for being unfeeling, not humanitarian at all in its treatment of children and vulnerable groups coming over the border. This has caused quite a bit of consternation, especially among Democrats. But again, if I look at the Democratic history, recent history here, Obama was very much a president that was quite in favor of pushing migrants back. And I think that some Republicans have been kind of reminding the American electorate leading up to this forthcoming election that, Biden can say what he likes, but he was vice president under a president who was very tough on Mexican immigrants. So, I mean, how do you then pass the various democratic experiences, shall we say? I mean, there's a lack of continuity between, say, Obama and perhaps another Biden administration. Would there be?
There's a lot there. Can I go further back and say that that presidents since the early 20th century have been trying to fix immigration at the border by building fencing and walls and barriers, and by putting money into border security and the border patrol and efforts to surveil and detain and deport and then deter, right? To deter people from coming. And that has been both Democrats and Republicans. That's really been a bipartisan strategy. Especially, you really see that ramping up after 1964. We passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1964, which placed a cap on migration from the southern border. And that's when you see successive, really every presidential administration since then try to solve the problem of undocumented or unauthorized migration at the southern border by pouring money and money, surveillance, machinery, equipment into the southern border. And then also increasingly, since the 1990s, these newer practices of detention inside the country, detention of people who are who are convicted of a crime, serve their sentence, but they're found to be undocumented immigrants, and then they're detained, then deported. So it's really a bipartisan strategy. And I think Democrats have to, like, their base expects them to be more, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know if merciful is too strong of a word, but sort of to be more compassionate to immigrants coming across the border, to acknowledge that immigrants are coming here because they're escaping something. But that doesn't mean that Democratic presidents and Democratic candidates don't want to try to become, that doesn't mean that Democratic candidates or Democratic presidents don't follow those same practices and policies of trying to enforce the border. And recently, Biden has been talking about issuing an executive order to somehow get control over the number of people who are coming and asking for asylum, who are crossing illegally and then asking for asylum in the United States, because that's a kind of, we can talk about this, but it's a bit of a legal loophole. It's not a legal loophole. It's legal for immigrants, for anyone, to ask for asylum in the United States. And then once they do, we are required to give them a hearing. And there's such a backlog in the immigration system right now that what's happening is that people who are coming into the United States legally or illegally and then asking for asylum are getting told that they can wait until their hearing. Well, that might be 5 years from now. So so that's a situation that's been ongoing, that's really increased under Biden, and he's eager to stop it, or to find a solution for it, because that's something that is, like I said before, causing him and Democrats anxiety, right? The perception that there are so many people arriving, and that the system is broken. So Biden is talking about getting tougher on immigration, but he's at the same time also talking about humanitarian pathways and acknowledging the complexities and meeting immigrants with compassion, which is what his base expects. Trump is not going to say any of that. I'm not a political analyst, but I'm watching the situation and reading the news and thinking about it, of course.
Well, speaking of all of that, Julia, I mean, now let's get drilled down into the specifics here. So Biden and Trump, generally speaking, you would say have a bipartisan issue. Oh, no, maybe I'll take a step back here. The Democrats and the Republicans have a bipartisan issue with regard to migration. If that is so, then what are the specifics? I mean, if you can tell us the specifics of what a new Biden administration is going to put forward, as opposed to what Trump is promising to put forward. I mean, I gather, just as an Australian looking at things, looking at the news cycle, Trump will build more walls and call Mexicans and Latin Americans a whole bunch of really nasty names leading up to the election to instill fear in the general American public that there are too many undocumented arrivals. And by the way, Julia, do you have any idea of how many undocumented arrivals we're dealing with here? Because here in Australia, we've got our own immigration problems. We've got people coming in from Southeast Asia, from Africa, the Middle East, and the government tends to tell us ever so often how many people we're dealing with.
Mhm.
How many people are you guys dealing with in the United States?
Well, there's a lot of disagreement about numbers, actually.
Right, right.
So the one number that's interesting is that in December 2023, we hit the highest monthly total on record of encounters with migrants, and it was 250,000 for the month. Now it's not 250,000 every month or every month of the year, because migration tends to follow seasonal patterns. There are times when it's
Yeah,
too hot for people to cross the desert, and
yeah,
there are other times when it's too cold. And
yeah,
so there's a debate now about how many undocumented migrants are in the country, and that's something that's very hard to count, because undocumented people have a legitimate fear of participating in things like the census, right? And if they live without papers, they're not on record. And so I shouldn't actually, I can't go too deep on numbers because I didn't pull them up, so I don't have them to hand, but I
it's all
can
right.
be happy to provide you with sources later. But there's something like 11 to 12 million. There's estimates that there are 11 to 12 million undocumented migrants in the country, but there's a lot of disagreement on that. And there was a really kind of like off the wall study that came out, I want to say 5 years ago, that's during the first Trump administration, that said there were actually 40 million in the country. Did I say thousand before? 11 to 12 million. And there's sort of one extreme study that said, no, there are actually 40 million. And there's so many that are going uncounted. And Democrats on the left are sort of keeping the count low on purpose to make the problem not look as bad as it does. So that numbers question can be a really political question.
Yeah,
Then there's something like so several million recent arrivals in the last, I think, 5 years, who have come and to ask for asylum, as I was just describing in this process that I was just describing to you. Now, they don't go into the total of undocumented migrants in the US because they are actually here with legal status, right? They have an immigrant, they're awaiting adjudication of their asylum cases. And so they don't count as undocumented migrants, but a lot of people view them as undocumented migrants because many of them have crossed the border without papers, right? And then presented themselves to immigration authorities and asked for asylum. And so that's all to say that the number question is complicated, and it's weighted, and it's difficult to parse out, and it sort of depends on who you ask. And so I would say if for your listeners who want to do research on this, some really good sources are the Pew Research Center, which is online and has all kinds of sort of numbers and statistics that are generally regarded to be very trustworthy. And then I want to make sure I have this right, where I get a lot of my numbers from MPI, the Migration Policy Institute, and that and both of those are claimed to be nonpartisan, but there's almost no migration organization that's completely nonpartisan or that's not viewed in some way as partisan. So if you're even
right.
remotely positive towards immigration, then people who are restrictionists will refute your numbers or will want to debate you.
When we talk about Mexican and Latin American immigrant communities in the United States, I mean,
Yeah.
undocumented, documented, whatever they are, they come in, they then become part of the American body politic. In
Mhm.
America, you use the term Hispanic as a catch-all phrase, which gives the
Mhm.
impression that all people from all Latin American countries are this Hispanic thing.
Yeah.
And that there's a Hispanic voting bloc. But we know that these are rubbery terms. We also know that, there are many groups in Latin America. You've got the Cubans, you've got the Venezuelans, you've got this, you've got that.
Yep.
And each one of them will have their own particular internal bias in how they view American policy, how they view the respective parties. Can you walk us through some of those complexities? What is the Hispanic vote in the United States?
Well, I mean, you've already done a better job than a lot of people in our political arena who will talk about the Hispanic vote or Latinos as a voting bloc
Yeah.
without understanding at all that they are that this is a really diverse group of people with diverse political perspectives and very different experiences, and a lot of okay, first to go back to the term, Hispanics is a term that some people like and has been used in official context, has been used in the census, and now seems to be giving way more to Hispanic and or Latino, like Hispanic/Latino. There's sort of it's actually in the term itself, there's something interesting, which is that people from Latin America come from different countries and they don't become Latino or become Hispanic until they're in the United States. And then they're lumped in this, again, sort of like monolithic concept of people from Spanish speaking countries. And then of course that excludes what about Haitians, what about people from Belize who speak English, right. What about all the people from Brazil, this enormous country where they speak Portuguese, right? But so there is this sort of very simplistic concept. It gets repeated in the media and by politicians of Hispanics as one single monolithic group. And so as you say, that's really wrong. I would say that there are several different ways to kind of differentiate that demographic group. A lot of it has to do with what country they came from. So as you said, somebody coming from Cuba is going to have a different set of experiences, different culture, different political perspectives than someone coming from Mexico. Someone coming from Venezuela recently is going to have a different perspective than someone who came from, I don't know, Argentina in the 1970s. I mean, really, you can take your pick from any of these countries. And also, it also is going to be like their political leanings are going to also depend on where they live in the United States, because Latinos, Hispanics, people who are Latin American, people of Latin American ancestry who live in Florida are a lot more likely to be more conservative, to support the Republican Party. And that has to do with where they came from. So that Florida is where a huge percentage of the Cuban origin population is, right? But also rising numbers of Venezuelans, of Nicaraguans, of people that are escaping, leftist dictatorships, and dictatorships that, have socialist in their name, but are overseeing countries that are disintegrating, are becoming subsumed by violence and sort of economic decline. And so those people are never going to vote for example, Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Socialist candidate, because they're socialist in the name, and it's just not going to happen. And so that's something that politicians would do well to understand that, and do better to understand that. I will say also, there are an increasing number of people who identify as Hispanics and Latinos who are supporting Trump, which you would think on the surface people wouldn't do, because he's come out and said, that he said a lot of things that could be things that are really derogatory towards Mexicans, towards Central American migrants. But that's why I said when people immigrated also matters, because people who came multiple generations ago often they're not going to automatically support immigration across the southern border. And sometimes you'll hear them saying similar things that you hear other native-born Americans saying, like, well, my ancestors came here legally, they waited in line and followed the laws, and and why should these new people be doing this? Or they'll say, well, my ancestors or my family was different. We came here to work, but now these people are coming here because they're, they'll connect them with, I don't know, cartels or drug dealing or other sort of dangerous things, gangs, gang violence. So yeah, it's really almost, I mean, I'm sure there are some people that are good at doing this, but sort of looking at the demographics and thinking about, well, based on where this person lives and where they're from and when they came, how are they going to vote? I think you could probably do some predictive work there. Another thing just to mention briefly is that there's a large and growing number of evangelical Hispanics and Latinos in the United States, and those will tend to vote Republican, and they'll tend to vote for Trump. The evangelical churches have gone really strongly for Trump across the country, regardless of whether they're Hispanic or Latino or white or not as much Black evangelicals, although there are some. And so that is also going to be predictive of support for, well, first in 2024, that is probably pretty predictive of support for Trump.
With regard to the evangelicals, you raise a very interesting point here. Is it that they were evangelicals prior to arriving in the United States, or is it a case of, for them to be seen to be normalized Americans, they shed their Catholicism in favor of adopting an evangelical mold for them to have an easier settlement process?
I would say both could be true, but there are a lot, the evangelical denominations of the Christian denominations have been really successful within Latin America. So a lot of people are evangelical before they migrate.
Okay.
Guatemala is is under 50% Catholic now. Brazil is right around 50% Catholic. Mexico is still in the high 80s, I think. But there's been a ton of growth in the evangelical population in Latin America. So a lot of people are evangelical before they cross the border. And then I'm not really sure if people who become evangelical, who shed their Catholicism and become evangelical in the United States, I'm not sure I can comment on why they're doing that. And I don't know that it often, yeah, I think a lot of Hispanic and Latino evangelical churches in the US will tend to be Spanish speaking. So a lot of them really are these recent immigrants who were evangelical before they came. So yeah, it's a really interesting question though, because I'm not sure assimilation in the United States, I'm not sure about religion as a vehicle of assimilation in the United States, because we're such a religiously diverse country. And, a lot of Catholic immigrants who came here historically stayed Catholic. And
this is true, but there has been an anti-Catholic bias among Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and I would even go so far as to say the fact that the famed Kennedy clan were Catholic caused a lot of heartburn among certain Protestant American circles. So I think maybe there's a bit of a carryover from that. I'm not sure. I'm not an American. I can't judge, but history tells me that there's a story.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a story, and that story of anti-Catholic bias is fascinating. I work at the Catholic University of America. I talk about this a lot and have colleagues who have done lots of research on it. Often the story is told, the narrative is kind of, well, there was a tremendous amount of nativism directed at Catholic immigrants, Irish, Italians, exactly as you say, Eastern Europeans, Poles, Lithuanians. And there was this concern always the nativist concerns are kind of the same, right? They're too different. They are not going to be able to assimilate. They're foreign and they're strange. And with Catholics, it was that they're going to be papists and they're not going to be able to be loyal Americans because they're going to be loyal to the Pope, right?
Correct.
So Catholics across those different ethnicities and nationalities, Catholics worked really hard to prove their American credentials, right? And to be patriotic and to go to war and be good citizens. And the narrative is often, sort of about anti-Catholic bias that sort of picks up with Irish immigration and peaks during the surge of Italian and Eastern European migration in the 1880s to 1920s. There's a Catholic political candidate for president whose name is totally escaping me right now in the 1920s who loses, and that's seen as kind of the, due to anti-Catholic bias. The KKK has an anti-Catholic strain, right? And then Kennedy is kind of supposed to be the end of the story. Like, he wins. I mean, yes, he causes anxiety, but he wins. And when he wins, Catholics have become, because of this immigration, Catholics have become a really significant majority, religious majority in the country. And they're widely accepted after, sort of after mid-century. So I'm not sure. It's an interesting thought, and it's an interesting question. And I would say that, we could talk about this more if you want, but the Catholic Church has absorbed these sort of many different waves of Catholic immigrants and grown as a result. And the Hispanic and Latino immigrants, despite the fact that there are an increasing number of them that are evangelical, they are also behind the growth, or at least the lack of decline of the Catholic population in the United States, right? Like, they are the largest source of growth for the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church is very concerned about, I would say, concerned about these trends in Hispanics and Latinos becoming evangelical. But that's sort of another topic. It is very interesting. Pew also has, the Pew also has good numbers on that, by the way, on sort of religion and religious identification in the United States.
We'll put a link in our show notes to the Pew site as well. I think that's going to be quite interesting for the listeners, I should say, to follow up on that. Okay, so I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the US, we're speaking with Associate Professor at the Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C., Julia Young. Julia, has the rhetoric surrounding Mexican and Latin American immigrants driven right-wing racism among Anglophone groups in the United States?
Another really interesting question. And there's a little bit of chicken and egg there. Like, where does the rhetoric come from? Does it come from kind of racism embedded in society, or does it come from the top, right? Does it come from politicians? Do politicians create that feeling, or do they kind of run on or create platforms based on that feeling? I've written about nativism in the United States, and I've talked about it already here, but just basically this idea that immigrants, that the foreign born, whoever they might be at whatever time you're talking about, right? But they are dangerous or a threat to the country, and specifically to the native born population of that country, right? So nativism is the idea that immigrants are harmful. And usually it's that they're harmful because, as I've said already, because they're too different, because they are dangerous somehow, because they are criminals, inherently criminal in nature, because they are an economic threat, because they'll take our jobs, right? So they're dangerous to the native born sort of economic, they're an economic threat. Or that they will overrun or overtake our culture. And those ideas, those concepts, as I've said already, have been applied to every successive wave of immigrants, right? So famously, and everybody talks about this, you have Ben Franklin in the 1700s fretting about German immigrants and how to the United States, to the newly independent United States, and how these Germans are going to come and we're all going to have to be speaking German, and they're not learning English, and they're not going to assimilate, and they're too dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And that's always trotted out as an example, but I still think it's a good example. Yeah. And then you have people saying that about, even sort of the early waves of like Scandinavians, Irish, anybody that was different. So initially different from those like early Anglophone, British Isles settlers, and then people that are different from the sort of then assimilated German Anglo settlers, right? And so So regardless of who the immigrants are, nativism is present. And I think it goes way, way back to, I mean, I think there's something in human nature about this fear of the other. And I think you can see that in the really long history of, people form group identities, and then they, possibly to strengthen those in-group identities, develop a kind of fear of people outside the group. And they also, especially in our, the last 10,000 years ago or so of our history, groups of people claim territory. And then they view any new arrivals to that territory as a potential threat, right? So, okay, so to get to now, some of that rhetoric around Mexican and Latin American immigrants specifically comes up, especially when talking about, well, these are dangerous immigrants because they are more likely to be criminals, because they're fleeing countries where there's a lot of gang violence. And you really saw this in the 2016 election here, when Trump ran for office in 2016. A lot of like these pictures of Central American gang members with tattoos on their faces, and like, this is who's coming. I mean, describing them as literally as rapists and criminals who are coming across the border. So none of this is new. This kind of rhetoric has been applied, as I've said over and over, to earlier waves of immigrants, but it definitely was applied also to Mexican and Latin American immigrants. In this case, in 2016, I think a lot of it really did come from Donald Trump, who had this enormous platform and enormous voice, right? But I don't think that means it wasn't there in the population before he said it. I think he spoke some things that were previously unacceptable to say in the public sphere and gave people permission to then repeat those things, reiterate those things online, and direct nativist or racist demonstrations towards those populations. But it's complicated because there's also, this goes back to something we were just talking about, like Hispanic voters who vote for Trump, or Hispanic voters who want to crack down on immigration, right? There's a way in which each successive generation of immigrants, which has been targeted by nativism, right, which has been described as a threat to the nation, then does immigrate, assimilates into society in some way, assimilates into the native-born society through various sort of mechanisms, or one way or the other, and then themselves direct that nativism towards other groups, right? Almost like people pulling up the bridge behind them, or so like one place that I think this is really interesting is looking at the history of Italian immigration, because you really saw some very similar rhetoric directed against Italian immigrants that you see directed against Latin American immigrants today, because there's organized criminal activity, right? The mafia, the Camorra, whatever you want to call it, that's active in Italy and then comes to the United States, follows Italian immigrants, and really impacts Italian immigrant communities, sets off a panic in the United States about, Italians are dangerous, they're criminals, they're gang members, and so they should be stopped. We should stop their immigration, right? Italian Americans in 2016 voted for Trump in large numbers. Not all of them, but Staten Island outside of New York has the most Italian Americans per capita in the United States, and went heavily for Trump in 2016, right? So the grandchildren and children of these Italian immigrants who experienced, or who have memories in their families of experiencing xenophobia and nativism, turned around and felt the same things towards new waves of arrivals. And I don't mean to sort of single out Italian Americans and say like, oh, they're horrible people. I just think there is this tendency in human nature, and here I'm veering into philosophy and not history, but to have anxiety about newcomers, about immigrants, about outsiders, about others.
Mm.
So I'll stop there. But
No, no, actually, it was really good. And reflecting on my own upbringing, I'm a child of migrants. My mother was originally from Austria, my father from northern Italy, and the
mm,
north-south Italian divide.
oh
It
wow,
perplexed many people here in Australia. When you said Italian, they obviously thought that there was an Italian bloc out there, and everyone was the same. But anyone with Italian blood knows that once you go south of Rome, it's a different equation entirely. So all the
yeah.
Camorra, the mafia stuff, that stayed predominantly in the south, but it polluted the north, and so everyone got condemned by being the dangerous other, the potential
Right.
mafiosi in the mix. So yeah, it was not fun having to deal with that, let me tell you.
Yeah, yeah, no, they were real, and I think still there are, I mean, there's still this culture in the US. I don't know, but we, of course, we export our TV and our movies. So I assume you got The Sopranos in
Oh yeah,
Australia,
yeah,
and I
yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
watched
One of
The
my favorite.
Godfather.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yes, my partner and I just saw The Godfather the other night.
Oh wow, oh wow, yeah. So yeah, I mean, there still are these associations with Italians, and but then nobody ever asks anymore, can Italians become Americans, right? Like that
Yeah, yeah,
question
yeah,
has been
yeah,
answered, and
yeah.
Italians are Americans. And I don't think that, I think there are still people asking that question about these new waves of immigrants as though they are sort of fundamentally different from these previous waves of immigrants. And I don't believe that's true, but
Yeah.
I believe that history shows us that these new waves of immigrants will incorporate into US society in similar ways as they have in the past. But I also believe that that probably means that they may turn around and have anxiety about whoever the newest waves of immigrants are after them. So
I think in terms of studying patterns of migration, you really need to be a historian because I see this a lot, both from an Australian perspective, because a lot of what you say
mhm,
reflects on how our immigration experience has been and continues to be. It's a political hot potato, and
yeah,
nothing easy or good comes from it. And of course, the echo chamber of the media manages to get all those negative messages out there, which just perpetuates this cycle. And we can't really do too much about that. Again, with integration happens over time, as you
right,
rightly pointed out.
right,
So we can't expect people to just step off the boat and "G'day, mate, I'm an Australian. I just came from Afghanistan, but now look at my accent." It doesn't
right.
work that way. As much as we would like it to work that way, no.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, Julia, just one final question, because I sadly we're running out of time, and I could talk
Okay,
to you
yeah.
for another
I
couple of
could talk
hours.
about this forever, but we'll do it again sometime.
Oh, absolutely, we will. I'm going to have to get you back on this one. Now, with regard to the fixation of the dangerous migrant, I
Yeah,
mean, when we look at the US-Mexico border, we often hear stories. And recently, I recall listening to a Joe Rogan podcast where I believe he was talking to Dr. Phil, and they were talking about not Mexicans coming over the border, but Chinese illegal immigrants
yeah,
coming over the border.
yeah,
And, basically, once they come over the border, they're undocumented arrivals, and magically they turn up in housing right next to critical American military sites, which to me
uh-huh.
sounded a bit weird, but
Yeah,
still, it seems to be part of that narrative about the dangerous migrant. Oh, it's not just the
yeah,
Mexicans coming over, it's the Chinese. Oh my God,
yeah.
they're all in the pay of Xi
So
Jinping.
yeah. So, and after 9/11, it was Middle Eastern terrorists. And so it's whoever we're afraid of at the moment. And I actually am doing a research project on the separate research project on Mexican history and Mexican migration in the World War II period.
Yeah,
And there was a significant contingent of the press in the US that was absolutely convinced that there was going to be a fifth column movement funded by the Nazis in Mexico, and that Mexican migrants were going to come across the border and like subvert the United States from inside, right? And there were these really hysterical articles about, I mean, not hysterical funny like hysterical hysteria, but also a little
yeah.
bit hysterical funny in retrospect about like fascist Mexicans inside our cities are going to, are going to open the door for Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, it was just beyond, right? So yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan and Dr. Phil, like two people not necessarily known for their historical knowledge or their nuance. I mean, but it is but it's interesting to think about that. I mean, yes, there has been this interesting recent globalization of migration at the southern border. It's really fascinating, and there are great stories on that, on like who's arriving and why, and how, you know, the southern border and this path to asking for asylum has become attractive to people who are seeking to leave their countries all over the world. So yeah, I don't know, the Congo, Mauritania, China, Afghanistan, Syria, I mean, you name it. It's really now everybody is crossing the US, into the US from the southern border, much smaller numbers than people coming from Latin America, but still significant. And those Chinese immigrants, right? I mean, I think it's pretty unlikely that it's an organized sort of movement of spies. I think it's much more likely that it's people that are leaving China because there are, for all the normal push factors that people leave their home countries, right? Because there's an economic downturn. Like there is actually, but there are actually economic problems in China right now, or that there's a lack of human rights and freedom, right? And so people are, they feel there aren't good enough opportunities for their children, wages are low, whatever those push factors are, and they're coming here because of the pull factors on our side of the border: higher wages, more freedom, more political stability, whatever you want to name it. I mean, I'm not just talking about Chinese migrants here, but really all migrants. Those push factors and pull factors are stronger than anything we do at the actual border to kind of address or fix the problem. So I guess I've said this on other podcasts and I write about this all the time, but as a historian of migration, this sort of like, I think I can't say it enough, that we have to look at the push factors and the pull factors if we want to kind of address migration, see if we can make migration happen in a more orderly fashion or a more humanitarian fashion. We can't do it unless we really understand these push factors, many of which have deep historical roots, and we understand why people are coming, and we stop only focusing on policing the border or building walls on the border or developing the perfect set of laws that's going to finally control migration. That's not what laws aren't what drive migration. Policies, they impact migration, but they don't address the root causes for migration. So, well, but I'm not either of the presidential candidates, so I'm not going to be able to say that on a on
That's a shame, Julia. That's a shame. We need more knowledgeable people like you in politics, that's for sure. Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem. Like, nuance doesn't really sell. There's not a lot of candidates that are like, vote for me, the person with the complex and nuanced answer and no solution.
Yeah, exactly. Julia, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, John. It's been great.
Associate Professor at the Catholic University of America, Julia Young. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the Media Center drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and/or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. We hope that you'll join us again as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.